Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. On the show today, we are going to talk about space debris, a problem that's persisted for years and is only getting bigger and dangerous for the world. After multiple incidents of space debris potentially colliding with the International Space Station last year, a recent incident that has now brought back the attention to this deep threat is from last week. 4 spherical metal balls fell from the sky in some villages of Gujarat over the past few days, which, as per some experts, are most likely the debris of a Chinese rocket or fuel storage tank of space launch vehicles. US-based astronomer Jonathan McDowell has claimed in a tweet that these metal spheres are likely debris of the Chinese rocket Chang Zheng 3B. He says the debris might have fallen over Gujarat during the re-entry of the rocket. While retired ISRO scientist B S Bhatia has been quoted as saying that these metal balls might be the fuel tanks used in rockets and satellites to store hydrazine, which is a type of liquid fuel. So as scientists determine the specific nature of the objects that fell from the sky in Gujarat, whether the debris belonged to a satellite or a fuel tank or some other object, the larger concern here is incidents like these pose multiple threats to the Earth and its inhabitants, to functional satellites and other numerous space objects. With more and more space launches and events like space tourism kicking off, the space above Earth is overcrowded, calling for urgent attention from countries to now declutter it. But how can it be done? How can the expanding problem of space debris be addressed? We'll try and understand some of these concerns from an esteemed panel of experts who are joining us on the program today. I'm pleased to welcome in the studio Mr. T.V. Venkateshwaran, Senior Scientist, Vigyan Prasad. Thank you, sir, for your time. And joining us virtually are Dr. Surendra Pal, former Senior Advisor, Satellite Navigation Program, ISRO, and Professor Prajwal Shastri. She's Adjunct Professor, International Center for Radio Astronomy Research. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on Sansad TV. Professor Shastri, allow me to begin the program today with you. In fact, with your response first on the incident that took place in Gujarat over the past few days. In 4 different locations over different time periods, metal objects falling from the sky have been reported. How serious is the incident, and have such incidents been reported in the past as well? How concerning is it, especially when we talk about space debris and its threat for the Earth?
Yeah, so I believe it is indeed a very serious incident, although in this particular case, just by chance, there may not have been a serious toll of injury and so forth. But this incident is just a symptom of the status of where we are in terms of the utilization of space. There are probably such incidents which do come up in the news off and on from multiple locations, but they somehow don't make headlines. Perhaps if there is no loss of life or something, then there is a tendency for them not to make headlines. But we do need to take them very seriously. It is a symptom of the fact that as like humanity, the space is actually humanity's public good. So it is a non-negotiable that it should be treated as such, and there should be international cooperation on the use of space and how many satellites are deployed, of what size, for what purpose, and what are the mechanisms and plans in place in order to have them not land up just entering the atmosphere in a random fashion, but in a planned fashion, so that there is no injury to either humans or ecological systems and so on. So this is a very important need of the hour, but as of now, I believe space cooperation, international dialogue, and agreements and treaties are not being strengthened. In fact, they're being weakened, and they're particularly weakened by the initiative of privatization, because then the accountability is much, much lower than before. And also now, because we have the capacity to launch small satellites, it's very difficult to monitor everything. So unless there is a very strong regulation and monitoring mechanism, we don't know what is going out into space. And
Absolutely.
so I think all of these things need to be dealt with in a non-competitive international cooperation framework with the mindset that space is a public good.
Certainly. So a global problem which needs to be dealt with in a sort of international framework, Mr. Venkateshwaran. But the fact is, when we talk about space debris, one important aspect that I would like you to explain to our viewers is, what are the kind of particles that actually form space debris? So how do we define it in scientific terms? And how much estimated junk is, as on date, believed to be there on the space above the Earth?
Very good. Actually, when the rocket is launched, usually it is multi-stage. So let's say, for example, the stage one, once the fuel is exhausted, it is actually dropped. So you can, in a way, call it as space debris, but then it falls within a few minutes, and then no longer we talk about it unless otherwise some fisher people, dig it out of the ocean, or it falls very near the ocean. Once the spacecraft enters the space, actually, I mean, like 100 kilometers is supposed to be the beginning of space. I mean, if you look at it, the other stages separate. So when they separate, lots of material, like for example, the ring which keeps the two stages attached, nuts, bolts, these things spread into the space, and then they are orbiting in the lower Earth orbit. That may be from 200 kilometers to about 300, 400 kilometers. You may have objects of like this. There is even, for example, a hand glove, which accidentally one person from International Space Station left it. I mean, the person forgot to tie it, so it just started floating, including a hammer and things like that. So there are various objects which are, some like this, some few are like this accident. By mistake, people in International Space Station left it. There are objects which, because of the technology of launch, it comes out of it. Then the most worrisome issue is the earlier spacecraft, spacecraft which were what we can call as the first generation and so on. They were not designed to fall back on Earth. So many of them are deadwoods and they are drifting in the space. And there have been three collisions, designed collisions, like you sent a missile to explode a spacecraft, and then that became, thousands of pieces, and they are all in the space. So these are the kind of space junk. If you are talking about the near Earth orbit, that is like 300, 500 kilometer kind of stuff. These are the various kinds which are over there.
Okay. Dr. Pal, if I quote some data and which comes from NASA's estimates, as of January 2022, the amount of material orbiting the Earth exceeded about 9,000 metric tons. So, which means the space above the Earth is literally running out of space. Is there a mechanism by which some of these objects, some of the unused satellites can be brought back? Is there a way to declutter the space?
Yeah, the topic is very important, and what you said, the concern is important. And first time, let me take a few seconds to tell you the history. In 79, the Skylab crashed, over Australia, and that became a big news. And a small piece of that one was taken, and some $100,000 were given. So that became a quite excitement. But later on, it was found that all the debris, man-made as well as natural, even small meteorites, when they go above the Earth, they also can disintegrate, and they also become a part and parcel of it. Space dust also becomes a part and parcel of it. So space debris is man-made as well as natural. All the things are there. And one mechanism was, there is an international interagency debris management committee is there. So they decided that we should put something that we can bring down the unused spacecraft or the last stage of the rocket, which Dr. Venkataraman said, to the lower orbit, which can enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn it. Now, that's a very loose statement was made, but there is no strict law for that one. Now, that was meant for mostly for the last stage of the rocket, and also the satellites which have got a control. Now we are putting small satellites which don't have a chemical control, only mechanical controls are there. When they become defunct, they should also be deorbited and should enter it. So that particular treaty or the rule is only informal. Formally, it has not come into existence. Another thing is that the ITU regulations and the USA regulations, the UN Space for Outer Space, those regulations are there, but they are not binding on the small satellites. They are binding on the satellites and mini satellites and above. They are not binding on the micro satellites or nano satellites. And nowadays, everybody tries to put the nanosecond satellites and micro satellites. So they become such a thing. So there has to be a law for it. You cannot. It's not possible to stop the launching of the satellites because we need satellites for the future. We need satellites for communication, for IoT, for so many applications we need it. So we have to have an internationally agreed thing that as soon as the satellites become defunct, it should re-enter. Second thing, the materials which are used, like the fuel balls, we have to use some material which while re-entering, it should get destroyed, not the material which does not get destroyed. Last thing which I want to tell you is that this is about, we are talking about low Earth orbit, below 800 kilometers height. Now, something has happened even in geosynchronous orbit also. Geo orbit also, the debris are quite both man-made as well as the natural ones are there. And RCA SATCOM, first, somewhere in 70s, got blasted. Nobody knows where it went. And it was assumed that some meteors came and hit it. So even the geo orbits are also not clear of these dangers. Now, NORAD of US, and I think Russia also has got thing. India is going for its Netra program, which will track the debris. And what NORAD gives the information is of the 1 centimeter cube. That sort of debris, if it's there, they give the information.
Okay.
But below those debris also are very dangerous. They can penetrate anything. And, the speed of those is typically 7 to 8 kilometers per second. So, it's worse than the bullet. So, the dangers are very. Now, the last thing which I want to tell, there was an experiment which was thought over. It has not been conducted, that there can be a large umbrella sort of thing which can take all the debris together and bring down to low Earth orbit and put it into the atmosphere so that it can get burnt. But that's the only concept. Nobody has tried it.
Certainly.
And
And
Chinese have tried to, change the orbit of the spacecraft. One of the experiments they conducted, but that was more for disturbing the orbit of the enemy spacecraft. And last, I think the Professor Shastri talked about was, about anti-satellite missiles, which, India also did it, and it makes some 2,000 pieces or so. China has done 2 times, and I think Russians also did it. So they also add to the man-made debris, and that becomes very dangerous. So overall, at the international level, there has to be strict regulations for these things, both for lower satellites which don't have control and controlled satellites. And we should also have a control on the materials also, so that they get burnt in the atmosphere. And what has happened in Gujarat, this is a very dangerous thing. If it falls with that speed of that thing, which object which is coming out is almost, if you even if you take the atmospheric drag, it's still very high. It can penetrate multi-story building also.
Certainly, Dr. Paul, and that is where the concern lies, Professor Shastri, that the fact that the space junk can stay afloat for several years makes it a bigger problem. And when incidents like these occur, thankfully, there have not been major collisions which have led to a major catastrophe, but the impending threat is something that cannot be overlooked. And that is where the concern lies. That is where all 3 of you have spoken about the need for an urgent international collaboration. There have been guidelines in place because the space sojourn is not something which is new for the world. There have been decades, there have been years since when the countries have been sending satellites. There have been guidelines. Tell us, where are the setbacks in terms of adhering to these guidelines? Why are they not, legally binding on the countries that are using space, which is a common space for the world? And what is needed to actually make them stricter going forth?
Okay. I cannot speak to exact incidents or violations of the guidelines. But I think there is a sort of broader failure which underlies the whole process of occupation of space. So there are certain things which should become non-negotiable, and it's not clear that they are non-negotiable. For example, weaponization of space should be a non-negotiable. There is no question about that. And this is something that all of humanity in principle should have a voice in. It's not clear that the current policy represents humanity's voice. Secondly, even the use of space for non-military purposes, even there, the regulation has weakened partly because of technology, because now it is far easier to launch things under the radar because there are multiple agencies which can launch these small satellites. And so it's very, very hard to regulate unless there are unless the regulation mechanisms get stronger, and they have not gotten stronger. They're kind of perhaps even outdated, I would say. Secondly, the whole issue of privatization, which I alluded to before as well. What privatization has done is two things. Firstly, it completely it reduces the accountability by a huge degree. And secondly, it creates these chains of connections. So if agency A is the one which actually does the physical launch of a satellite, and the satellite belongs to agency B, B does not have an agreement with A. There is a whole chain of people with whom these agreements go. And so then it becomes very difficult to trace responsibility and accountability.
Two things that have been pointed out by the speakers before you. One is tracking the objects. So help us understand, because for bigger particles, we understand it can be tracked and monitored from ground radars and other equipment. But for smaller particles, which stay afloat in the space, how dangerous they are, one. And number two is on the experiments that have been made by countries even now. So, for example, what Dr. Pal mentioned was about China. That, of course, is something that should be concerning. So, in the shadow of doing something good for space, it is actually targeting its enemies and adversaries, and that, unfortunately, is India. So, how concerning is that for us?
Yeah, first some figures.
Yes.
See, when we look at low Earth orbit, meaning that you are putting some space object at some 300 kilometer, 400 kilometer, 500, that range, roughly, okay, it's not a very exact number, but roughly 4,550 satellites have been launched till now for the low Earth orbit, of which 2,788 are launched by US, one country. Out of this 2,788, 2,354 are by private agencies. Okay, so about 400 are by the US government, and 1,900 is what is called as Starlink satellites. They are all very small satellites. So the problem is that there is an international informal agreement that when you put some satellite into space, you will inform an agency. So you will put it in a right place so that you won't collide with others, and then after its lifetime you will deorbit it so that you will vacate that space and all that. But this is only informal. So how much the private players actually play to this rule is a big question mark. I mean, nobody, it's a big guess. Okay, so that's one major challenge that we have. Coming to tracking, the tracking trouble is basically because when it is very far away and when it is very small, how best you can track is also a technological challenge, plus also cost. I mean, if I'm going to track, I may have a reason for doing it, right? So that becomes a challenge. That is one potential area. For example, international cooperation might better give us a much finer detail into particles, smaller size. But right now we are able to do something like 1 centimeter cube. So that will help us. India is also building its capacity because if we have our space assets, we want some protection for it. Absolutely. That's a thing. Thirdly, there is an important challenge, like say if you are looking at the geostationary orbit. That's where, for example, right now this program, most likely you are watching through the signals which are coming from a geostationary satellite. Okay, your dish is picking up. That's connected to a geostationary orbit. That's about 38,000 kilometers away from Earth. So it's going to take about 24 hours to go around the Earth. So it's literally like on top of your head. There are only about 1,700 parking slots. Already roughly about 500 parking slots have been occupied. Who is going to occupy a parking slot above, let's say, Pacific Ocean? Maybe few, maybe you may have a weather satellite, etc. But that's not the main prime space. Yes. Prime space is above landmass where huge people are there, where huge communication possibilities, potentials are there. There is already 1,700 applications for blocking this space. There is no challenge. There is a space parking slots above India. But India has no control over it. First come, first serve basis. Okay? So because of this, if you look at countries in South America, they don't have any space because already America has occupied all those spaces. So there is a debate within international community that we need to relook at this. Because when this international law, there is an international law, which has been signed by most of the countries, including India. But that law was signed when mostly it was national governments who were launching satellites. Even if it was private satellite, the national government had some kind of a control over it. But with private launching companies coming in, the area is becoming completely different today. I think we need to have a relook over there. Like it was pointed out by other speakers, regulation becomes a very key part today if we have to manage this.
Absolutely. So what are the kind of collaborations India is undertaking is something that will come back to you very quickly. But before that, Dr. Paul, one question from you is, Mr. Venkateshwaran spoke about how it's actually not just the problem of space debris, but overcrowding in areas. And he cited the example of how parking slots are full, especially when we talk about in terms of going out on a weekend. So it's particularly difficult. It's a similar situation above us in space as well. Is there a way in which, some kind of space traffic management system can be enabled? Have there been efforts by countries, especially the developed countries who have been into this area for long? And is India also working towards enabling some kind of traffic management in space so that everyone benefits from this space, which is for common good?
Yeah, what Mr. Venkateshwaran has talked about is in the geosynchronous orbit that is 36,000 kilometers high. There is now what they are doing is earlier gap between the two satellites used to be some 4 or 5 degrees. Now the technology has been developed. Even India also doing. Couple of satellites are put at the same orbit slot, and they have tight control on their attitude and orbit control. Similarly, that way the geosynchronous orbit things are getting managed. And also spot beams are being generated, so that there is no interference between the satellite to satellite. This is the technological challenge which are being met. But as far as low Earth orbit satellites are concerned, there is no regulation for that one. And where, the Elon Musk has put his thousands of satellites or, some student satellites, the last stage of the rocket becomes the debris. Other things are there. So there is no rule, regulation for those things. Actually, regulations are needed for the low Earth orbit, that is below 800 kilometers orbit. And then another thing is there is another third orbit is coming, second orbit that is around 18,000 to 20,000 kilometers height, where navigation satellites are there. And we did not enter into that slot. So India has gone to 36,000 kilometers. So that way our navigation satellites, Navik is much better, and in Gagan also is much better condition. And we follow the rules and regulations much better than the other countries. So we are a civilized country as far as space utilization and launching is concerned.
Absolutely.
But
in fact, one of the reports that I was reading...
Needed, and I think persons have to talk to each other, because we know, I don't want to go into how UN is effective or how UN agencies are getting effective. They are not becoming that effective. Particularly anti-satellite missiles, they break it, and there is no rule for that. And although there is an understanding you should not do it.
Absolutely. Dr. Paul, taking on from what you are saying about India, in fact, one of the reports I was reading said India's contribution to space debris had increased sharply in 2019 after our first ever anti-satellite test, but now we've been able to bring it down. help us understand how that degradation has happened. How have we been able to, bring down the number of debris, number one? And because, now we have this twin challenge of having a sustainable policy, not just to save our Earth, but also to save the space above Earth. So going forth, what is the kind of collaboration that India has to undertake with our partner countries to actually develop a sustainable policy?
Okay, see, when you are born, you are put in a cradle. So you think cradle is your home, but soon you realize that cradle is only a small space, but you will have to actually move around. So the space is not beyond Earth; it's part of Earth. I mean, without that, I don't think in future we can live as a civilization, as human being. So don't think it as something outside; it's a part of us. Okay, fine. We now have the capacity to go there. That's how we should look at it. So if we look at it from there, the space debris, as I said, I mean, man-made or human-made, are essentially, junks which comes out of when you are doing launching. When in the earlier era, most of us were careless, saying that, oh, space is very big, so if I leave a, a non-functional satellite there, nothing, no problem. It's like, once upon a time, maybe if your car is totally gone off, you will park somewhere and go away. But now we know that we can't do that because we are in a crowded city, right? So earlier, because of that kind of a thing, we were careless. Then, of course, this anti-satellite attacks done by many countries, which has broken satellites, and a lot of debris of that kind are there. So various ways it's there. But still, I think one thing that we should remember is, it is a global problem, but the problem's main originator is few countries. Mostly developed countries, because they were the people who have put so many rockets into space, and particularly many of the private players have not played by the gentlemanly agreements that countries had. India followed it, others were not following it.
It's quite similar to the climate change action, where we are seeing the developed countries have actually emitted far more, gases into space as compared to the developing world. But now the onus is on the developing countries to actually act on climate change. So
That's
quite
exactly
similar,
right.
but very rightly put forth by Mr. Venkateshwaran, that it's a global problem, and therefore concerted collaborative efforts on multiple fronts are needed. Dr. Pal, one quick closing comment from you on what is the way ahead. How do we need to have a sustainable policy to save our Earth, which includes the outer space?
You see, we can't do anything as far as the natural debris are concerned, okay? But we can to mitigate the total situation, what we can do is we should find out their positions, that we should track those debris, and whatsoever our active systems are there, we should try to avoid those things. Because whatsoever has been done, we cannot do. And for the future, whatsoever goes, it becomes we should put some fuel or some mechanism by which it should become deorbited once it becomes deactivated. So there should be fuel, there should be power in that one, and many countries do it and bring it down. The last thing which India tried was to put the fourth stage of our PSLV rocket, try to make it as a satellite and try to bring down again by fuel, bring it back to the Earth, or bring it to the atmosphere so it gets burned, and not to use the materials which cannot get destroyed. So these are the only things. And NORAD is the US thing. I don't have much idea about Russian thing, but India is entering Netra, and Chinese have not told anything about it.
Absolutely.
One more thing is there, the satellites which are registered with the ITU, the spy satellites are not registered, and there are lots of spy satellites are running here and there. So those are not registered, and those satellites are tracked. We don't know what they are doing. So there has to be some sort of, self-imposed moratorium on every country, that whatsoever we are launching, others should know about it and which orbit they are.
Certainly.
Then
And
only things can be done.
in the short term, what's important is for countries to conform to space debris mitigation guidelines, because it not just impacts the current generation. Every now and then we keep hearing of incidents like what happened in Gujarat last week. There was a potential threat to the International Space Station last year as well. But it also has potential damages for our future generation, for which we need to conform to these guidelines which have been created. Well, so time is running out. It's an interesting discussion, but we'll have to wind up at that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, and also Professor Shastri, for joining us on the program, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. It was a pleasure having you on the program today. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective. Thank you to all our viewers as well for their time. See you again tomorrow with a new topic and a different set of panelists. Take care until then and keep watching Sansad TV.